Good morning, everybody. You know, there's a couple different subcommittee meetings today, but good morning. I don't know who that is. Doesn't matter. It's not my wife. That's the important thing. Good morning. Welcome to the Energy Subcommittee for a legislative hearing on a discussion draft that authorizes DOE to conduct a pilot program to lease spare capacity in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. I want to thank Vice Chairman Barton and Ranking Member Rush. I'm sorry, I'm looking at 8 different things, for partnering on this draft as we continue our work to modernize the Department of Energy. The SPRO is the world's largest emergency stockpile of crude in the world. More than 40 years ago, Congress authorized the creation of SPRO in response to the Arab oil embargo to mitigate the threat of an energy supply disruption. Back then, our domestic production was in the decline. Energy costs were rising, and we were becoming increasingly reliant on imports. The oil embargo exposed our vulnerabilities, and panic quickly spread. Some of us will remember those long lines at the gas pump for sure. So let's go to today. The U.S. is arguably more energy secure now than ever before. We're the #1 world producer of oil and gas, and our imports have declined by about 70% since peaking in 2005. With the surge of domestic production, our private stocks of crude oil are at record levels, our pipelines are full, our refineries are operating at near peak capacity. So I want to thank our witnesses on both panels for appearing before us today to provide their views on this legislation. I want to thank Vice Chair Barton and Ranking Member Rush for their work on this important piece of legislation as well. I look forward to working with both of them and all members of the subcommittee as we move this bill, hopefully, to the House floor in the coming months. And I now yield to the Ranking Member of the subcommittee, Mr. Rush, for an opening statement.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing this morning, examining legislation to authorize a pilot project to commercialize SPRO. As you know, Mr. Chairman, subcommittee staff from the minority and the majority sides worked together on this bipartisan bill, and I'm pleased to co-sponsor this legislation with my good friend and colleague, Mr. Martin of Texas. Mr. Chairman, since the inception of the SPRO, which was, as you indicated, established as a result of the oil shortages of the 1970s, the energy portfolio of the United States has changed dramatically. In fact, the U.S. is expected to go from a heavy importer of foreign oil to become the global leader in oil exports by as early as next year, according to the IEA. As a result of these shifting dynamics, Mr. Chairman, it is important for policymakers, including members of this subcommittee, to examine important questions, including if there is still a need for the SPRO. If so, how large should it be, and how should it be configured? It is my hope, Mr. Chairman, that the pilot program outlined in this bill will help inform our decisions regarding the SPRO, regarding the feasibility of leasing out all or part of the SPRO to the private sector or to foreign governments even, those that do not pose a national security risk. As we will discuss today, congressionally mandated sales of SPRO oil has provided an opportunity to potentially lease the subsequent unused space to private companies and or foreign governments as a way to maximize taxpayers' return on investment. Mr. Chairman, I'm also pleased that we have with us today representatives from both the Department of Energy and the GAO among other witnesses, as both agencies have issued reports to help guide our decision-making on matters regarding the spill. Unfortunately, Mr. Chairman, there appears to be some discretion between the two agencies over the final recommendations that GAO made in its May report entitled Strategic Petroleum Reserve. DOE needs to strengthen its approach to planning the future of the emergency stockpile. First, Mr. Chairman, DOE appears to concur with the GAO's recommendation to supplement its 2016 review by conducting additional analysis regarding the objectives and purpose of the spill, taking into account additional factors such as market projections and private sector response. DOE also agreed with the GAO's recommendations to periodically re-examine the size of the spill with analysis looking at the costs and benefits of the spill for a variety of different sizes. NEO also appears to concur with the GAO's findings that the agency considers options for the long-term configuration of the spill after the impact of congressionally mandated sales of spill oil are taken into account.
That's not my wife either.
Maybe it's my new wife.
Your new wife. Yeah, that's right. Better answer it.
Yeah.
We want to keep you married another 60 years.
Yeah, all right, Mr. Chairman. Hold on, dear. Based on the testimony, it appears that some of these recommendations will be included as a part of DAO's small post-sale configuration study, expected to be completed in October this year. Mr. Chairman, the largest area of disagreement appears to be over GAO's recommendation that DOE, the Department of Energy, conduct a cost-benefit analysis of establishing regional product reserves around the country in areas that have been identified as vulnerable to fuel supply disruption. Mr. Chairman, I hope that we can get to the bottom of this, and I look forward to the testimony provided by our witnesses today. And finally, I want to tell our witnesses that we appreciate them being before us today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair will recognize the chairman of the full committee from the good state of Oregon, Mr. Walden, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, over the course of the past year, the Energy and Commerce Committee has been hard at work identifying what's necessary to modernize the Department of Energy's national and energy security functions. The urgency of our focus has been driven by domestic and international challenges that will be confronting the nation in the decades ahead. These challenges, which range from maintaining our nuclear security to protecting the reliable supply and delivery of energy, require a Department of Energy that has appropriate organization, management focus, and authorities to succeed in its missions. In recent months, the committee has moved legislation that will establish enduring leadership within the DOE for addressing all energy emergencies, including cybersecurity threats. It has moved legislation that will ensure there is sufficient coordination for a secure and reliable delivery of fuels we rely upon for our energy needs, including bulk electric power. And just over the past few weeks, we moved legislation that will strengthen DOE's support for next-generation nuclear energy. We've also moved reforms that streamline DOE's cumbersome regulatory approval process for foreign nuclear commerce, which has inhibited American businesses from competing effectively in global nuclear energy markets. So with today's draft legislation that Vice Chairman Barton and Ranking Member Rush have put together offers a similar forward-looking path. This one toward ensuring the nation's strategic petroleum reserve, managed by DOE, will be more capable of responding to oil supply emergencies for decades to come. Congress, under this committee's leadership, established the SPRO in the wake of the 1973-74 Arab oil embargo. Now, that incident and gasoline shortages and price spikes of ensuing years really underscored the growing vulnerability of the United States to the international oil supply shocks, especially as reliance on imported oil was rapidly increasing. Well, times have changed, of course, and dramatically. The resurgence in American oil and gas production over the past decade has placed the United States into a dominant role when it comes to global oil and gas supplies and has begun to shift how we should view our SPRO assets. While the role of the SPRO may be shifting, it remains important for energy security. It will continue to help us meet our treaty-level obligations to international partners in the event of major supply disruptions. It will also help maintain our international energy diplomacy, inhibiting adversaries from attempting to use oil as an economic weapon, which ultimately benefits our own and our allies' energy security. Yet we know that SPRO facilities require considerable upgrades to be responsive when called upon. And as Congress has mandated sales of some 290 million barrels, there's risk that without serious reforms, much of the reserve's capacity to serve as a strategic stockpile will degrade further as those stocks decline. So against this backdrop arrives the draft legislation, which offers an innovative way to accelerate reforms to the SPRO by leasing underutilized space created as the reserve is drawn down over the next decade. A successful leasing program would attract investment into improving facilities operations that would be responsive to commercial needs. This, in turn, would enable more responsive use of federal oil stocks during those emergencies. And by preserving the existing capacity of the reserve's caverns, the pilot program also ensures this asset will remain available for DOE security missions well into the future. So I appreciate the testimony of those who are testifying today, and we'll continue to work on this legislation. I don't know if anybody else wants the balance of my time, but if not, I will yield back.
Chairman yields back. Chair would recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today we'll be discussing bipartisan draft legislation on the future of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. In December 2016, then Chairman Upton and I wrote the Government Accountability Office requesting that GAO review the Strategic Petroleum Reserve as it is currently configured. We asked whether there might be more cost-effective options for protecting against supply shocks and for meeting our international obligations. Most other countries have used contracts with private companies to address these matters, so it's fair to ask whether there might be more efficient and effective ways for us to address our energy security needs in this area. There were a number of reasons why I thought this request to GAO was particularly important in 2016. First, former Energy Secretary Moniz had laid out one vision for modernization of the SPR in the Quadrennial Energy Review that the Obama administration released in 2015. As part of that vision, Secretary Moniz suggested the establishment of more regional refined product reserves, like the Northeast Home Heating Oil and gasoline supply reserves. Second, at the end of 2015, Congress lifted the 40-year-old ban on crude oil exports, and this was done at a time when we were seeing a radical alteration of the transportation fuels landscape. Supply was increasing, demand was decreasing, and we were seeing a rise in electric vehicles. Third, beginning in 2015, Congress had turned to the SPR repeatedly as an offset for deficits, highways, and other items. In fact, it has been used far more in recent years for those purposes than for energy security. And recently, the Trump administration has even been sending signals that it's seriously considering releasing oil from the reserve for the express purpose of lowering gas prices, in my opinion, to help Republicans heading into the midterm elections. When you get to the point where an administration is publicly discussing using the SPR for blatantly political purposes, then it is certainly a good time to discuss the future of the reserve. And this discussion is also timely now, since we're already requiring the sale of so much oil for non-energy reasons, which will free up a great deal of physical space in the reserve. We need to consider ways to ensure taxpayers continue to receive value for the salt dome storage caverns and associated facilities that comprise the crude reserve if they're not being used to store oil. The draft legislation that Vice Chairman Barton and Ranking Member Rush are championing is an important first step in realizing that goal. The draft bill would facilitate the leasing of unused storage space in the reserve while attempting to ensure the government and taxpayers benefit from those leases. And that's important no matter what the future has in store. If we elect to keep the SPR in its current form, the Energy Department will need to repair and upgrade facilities to keep them useful. And if we elect to create regional reserves either in addition to or in place of the SPR, we'll still need to fund those regional reserves. And this bill will help bring in the revenue we need to do that. There are still questions that need to be answered about this proposal. I want to make sure that the taxpayers see meaningful return on the investment that we've made in the SPR, and I want to ensure that the government isn't left holding the bag for environmental liability costs while private industry gets all the benefits of a leasing arrangement. So as long as we can get assurances on these two key points, I think moving forward with this pilot project makes a lot of sense. And unless someone else wants the time, I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Thank you. We're joined again by two panels. We'll start with Stephen Winberg, Assistant Secretary of Fossil Energy from the Department of Energy. We welcome you here. We appreciate you submitting your testimony in advance, and if you wouldn't mind taking no more than 5 minutes to summarize that, at which point we'll go into questions, that'd be terrific. The time is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Upton, Ranking Member Rush, and distinguished members of this committee. It's my pleasure to appear before you to discuss the Department of Energy's Strategic Petroleum Reserve and the related use of underutilized SPRO facilities resulting from congressionally legislated crude oil sales. The mission of the SPRO, as has been discussed, is to protect the United States economy from severe petroleum supply interruptions and to carry out U.S. obligations under the International Energy Program. As a member of the International Energy Agency, the United States has two primary objectives. First, as a net importer, the United States must maintain crude oil and/or refined product inventories, whether held by industry or government, equal to at least 90 days of net petroleum imports. As of June 30th of this year, the United States held about twice that amount. Second, the United States must be able to contribute a proportionate share of an IEA collective action response based on its share of IEA oil consumption, which is currently at 41.4%. The U.S. government relies on the use of SPRO to meet this requirement, although commercial stocks may also contribute, albeit voluntarily. In the event of an international oil supply disruption large enough for the President to authorize the release of the SPRO, U.S. crude oil production alone would not be able to ramp up quickly enough to make up for the lost barrels in a crisis. The SPRO can be ready to deliver crude oil within 13 days of a presidential finding, while domestic production would take months to substantially expand. Turning to the proposed legislation, it is expected that the SPRO will have approximately 300 million barrels of unused storage capacity by the end of fiscal year 27, or roughly 45% of the current design capacity. To that end, DOE is currently conducting the SPRO post-sale configuration study that will recommend the configuration of the SPRO post-2027. This study should be completed within the next 6 months, and understanding the best configuration for the SPRO will guide us as we continue to sell barrels over the next several years. It will also guide us in identifying the SPRO storage caverns or related facilities likely to become underutilized or operationally inefficient, therefore informing possible decisions concerning site decommissioning. Further, determining the optimum configuration for the SPRO to meet domestic needs will be critical in developing and executing this proposed pilot program. The Department is supportive of maximizing the value of this taxpayer-funded asset, and there are a number of issues that need to be considered related to the configuration of the SPRO post-27. Therefore, we believe it is premature to comment on the operational feasibility of commercially leasing underutilized storage, but I can discuss with you some of the challenges. Further, it is important for both Congress and the Department to consider the impact of using government facilities to compete with commercially available petroleum storage capacity. Finally, we need to review the logistical and infrastructure challenges associated with a likely commercial requirement for increased inflow and outflow activities. Accommodating this requirement may require large upfront capital expenditures to enable commercial leasing. I would also like to take this opportunity to discuss the recently released GAO report titled Strategic Petroleum Reserve. I would like to focus on the one recommendation the Department did not concur with. Specifically, we did not concur with the recommendation to conduct or complete studies on regional refined product reserves. It's important to understand that while hurricanes and other natural disasters may create severe short-term logistical constraints for gasoline supplies that therefore impact gasoline prices, These constraints and price increases are quickly overcome when the hurricane passes. This was evidenced by Hurricane Irma in 2017. Even if more gasoline was available in Florida during Hurricane Irma, there would not have been enough trucks or other transportation infrastructure to get the supplies to the retail gasoline stations where they were needed, due to first increased evacuation traffic and then later flooded roads. So given the cost of above-ground gasoline storage, it would be inappropriate to use taxpayer funds to conduct any additional studies on the use of federally owned storage of refined petroleum products. While there is certainly more information about the SPRO that I could discuss, I will refer the committee to my written testimony submitted to the record. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, this completes my prepared statement, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for coming up this morning. I have a couple of questions. My first couple relate to the GAO study that I know that you're familiar with that was published in May, 2 months ago. On page 27, it talks about the DOE could close at least one SPRO site based on the analysis by CBO of projected excess storage capacity. For example, if DOE were to close the smallest SPRO site, Bayou Choctaw, the agency could also explore selling the connected pipeline and marine terminal, which is currently being leased to a private company. DOE could consider leasing excess storage capacity to other countries so that they could store oil at SPRO. DOE has not entered into any such leases with other countries, has not considered such leases, because according to DOE, the SPRO has historically lacked capacity to store additional oil. DOE has not proposed any of these options or explored the revenue the agency could generate by selling or leasing these assets. According to DOE officials, the agency would examine the feasibility of such options in the ongoing SPRO post-sale configuration study. Does that sound like a potential that DOE would support?
Yes, yes, we would. The first requirement we have under SPRO is to make sure that we're meeting our domestic requirements as well as our IEA requirements. And so, based on the math and reducing the SPRO by some 300 million barrels, I think it's quite possible that we may end up deciding we can close one of the sites. Which site, we don't know yet, and that's the purpose of the SPRO post-sale configuration study. Completing that study, then will inform us on which caverns we need to keep open, which facilities we need to keep open, so that we can meet those requirements. Not all caverns are alike, and so various of our caverns can discharge oil at faster rates, and so we need to do that study so that we clearly understand what our options are, and then also, sir, our options with respect to using these facilities in a commercial nature.
Now, as you know, we have the author of the EPCA bill, Mr. Barton, down at the end of the dais here. Officials said that under EPCA, Energy Policy and Conservation Act, it gave DOE authority to lease underutilized storage to other countries, but not to the private sector. DOE doesn't currently have the authority to pursue that, according to the agency officials. What is the department's view on opening that up, on making that change to allow the DOE the authority to sell to the private sector as well? Are they supportive of that? Would they?
Yes, yes, we are supportive. But if I might, there are some technical challenges with doing that. So let me start off with other IEA member companies that also have a reserve requirement. That would be generally for long-term storage. We wouldn't expect to be moving that product in and out of the caverns. In a commercial situation, that may not be the case. In a commercial suppliers of oil use the storage and then discharge and then want to inject and discharge. So there's a cycling mechanism. And the challenge with this particular geography or geology is that these are salt caverns. And the way we discharge oil out of these caverns is we inject fresh water. And that starts to erode the walls of the cavern in the lower part of the cavern. And so if you do that numerous times, you may affect the integrity of the salt cavern. So what we would need to do to go to a commercial operation where they were going to inject and discharge on a very regular basis, we would have to go with what we call a brine drive system, meaning we would use saturated brine water, and we'd have to store that and then inject that down into the caverns so that we weren't dissolving the walls of the cavern. And we have not yet come up with a cost for doing that, but we know that it is not going to be inexpensive. And that's part of the post-sale configuration study, is to begin to look at those costs.
Great. Thank you. My time has expired. Mr. Rush.
Assistant Secretary Winberg, will the DOE's sprawl post-sale configuration study, which will be out and released in October, examine issues that will help to determine the future optimal size of the sprawl? Will that study make recommendations regarding opportunities to lease sprawl storage space to the private sector or to other countries that are part of the IEA's collective action? And if not, when can we expect information from DOE on those specific topics of interest?
I'm calling you. Every time you speak, I'm calling you. Yeah.
I see that. I'm going to turn you off, man.
The post-sale configuration study, sir, will indeed address the optimal size for the SPRO to meet U.S. needs and also our IEA requirements. It will help inform us on what caverns we might be able to use for leasing purposes. As I mentioned earlier, if we're going to lease those caverns to other IEA member countries, it's considerably easier in terms of the mechanics of utilizing that storage. The post-configuration study will not be able to give us complete guidance on what we might be able to do in terms of leasing to the commercial sector. That's going to take some more work beyond the configuration study. And what I would propose we could and should do for the commercial market is to send out a request for information, an RFI. And we'd be looking for 2, maybe 3 basic bits of information. Number one, does the commercial marketplace value this asset? Number two, in what manner would they like to use the asset? Meaning, would they want to inject oil and then extract oil on a very frequent basis? Because then that will help inform us on what upgrades we need to make. And then number three, how does the private sector view the federal government stepping into oil storage leasing business, which has been the domain of the private sector for many, many years? And so those are the 3 pieces of information that we would want to glean from this RFI. With that information, I think that would help inform us on what type of a leasing program we would want to develop, whether we would want to have the entity leasing the facility to make the investment necessary so that they can inject and extract, or whether we make that investment, which would take appropriation, appropriations, and then factor that into the cost of the lease. So a lot of moving parts there.
All right, I'm going to move on to another area. Can you briefly discuss the disagreement between GAO and DOE regarding the recommendation that the department conduct a cost-benefit analysis for establishing regional product reserves in areas around the country that may be vulnerable to fuel supply disruptions? Why does DOE disagree with this recommendation? And is this disagreement only due to funding issues?
It's in part due to the cost, but it's in part due to the viability of petroleum, refined petroleum reserves, gasoline storage. So let me start with the logistics, and I talked about this in my testimony a little bit. Having regional or even state gasoline storage reserves above ground doesn't necessarily solve the problem, because you need to get that stored gasoline to the retail outlets, the gasoline stations. The problem is when you're in an evacuation situation along the coast. Florida, I think, is probably a good example of what happened during the Hurricane Irma. You couldn't get the gasoline from the storage to the retail outlets because the roads were being used for evacuation. Right after the hurricane passed through, then the roads were flooded. And so having that storage wouldn't have done Florida much good at all, perhaps none at all. And so we'd be incurring quite a cost in order to maintain regional or state gas reserves around the country. We spend about somewhere between $10 and $30 million per year on the Northeast Gasoline Supply Reserve. It currently has about 1 million barrels of gasoline. And so multiply that by whatever number of regional refined petroleum facilities we might contemplate. The costs get pretty expensive pretty quickly, and we may not be able to use it because of the logistics of getting it to the retail stations.
Thank you. Gentleman yields back. Mr. Barton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Rush for scheduling this hearing. I'd like to make a few comments and then have a few questions. First, I want to thank Congressman Rush for working with me as one of the two lead bipartisan sponsors. Legislation, I think, always is better if it is bipartisan, and certainly we on the majority side want to make every effort to make this bipartisan. I was very heartened by the opening comments of Mr. Rush and Mr. Pallone. I think we've got a chance to help the country if this draft becomes, in fact, a bill and is passed. It doesn't change the basic mission statement, doesn't change the authorized level of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, doesn't change the presidential authority. What it does do is add to the mission statement. It gives the Secretary of Energy the authority, so long as it doesn't impact the basic existing mission statement, the ability to lease and utilize underutilized capacity of the existing SPR to the private sector for storage and hopefully utilization of crude oil. I think that's an important point, that we're not trying to change the basic statement that was became law in the 1970s. We're just trying to adopt the SPR to the modern situation. A couple of questions for our friend from DOE. What is the authorized capacity currently of the SPR in terms of millions of barrels?
Yeah, the design capacity is 712 million barrels. In 2018, right now, we have 660 million barrels. And in 2027, we will be down to 405.
But what did Congress authorize the capacity to go up to? I thought we were about 900 million barrels. Is that not true? Well, I can find out. I just thought you might know.
I'll get back to you on that.
Okay. Whatever the authorized capacity is, if I understand you correctly, the existing physical capacity is a little over 700 million barrels. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And of that, how much oil is actually stored right now?
We have 660 million barrels stored right now.
Okay, so we're not quite at 100% of existing physical capacity.
That's correct.
Okay. If this draft legislation becomes law, whatever the authorized capacity is, and let's assume that it is 900 million, because I think that's right. Under this pilot program, would it authorize the Secretary of Energy, if it meets all the other requirements under the draft legislation, to actually add capacity to the SPR so long as it doesn't go above the authorized level?
In order to add capacity above the 712 would take some additional capital investment in the facility to get.
But there's nothing in the law that would prevent going above what's physically available today. Is that not correct?
I believe that's correct.
Okay. I had one more question, but I think I'll yield back. One final comment. We don't claim, Mr. Rush and I, that this draft is perfect. If we go through the hearing and there are things that we need to change, I think I speak for everybody on the majority side that we're very open. But I also think I speak for the majority and the minority that we hope that this is something that can move reasonably expeditiously, and that means actually end up in a bill the President signs in this Congress. And with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you for your leadership, and Mr. Rush's and Mr. Pallone, and I yield back.
Chair, I would just say that I'm delighted that the two of you are working on this, something that needs to be done, and we look forward to getting this to the President's desk before the year is out, if we can. Mr. Pallone is recognized for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, the idea of establishing regional refined product reserves came out of the first quadrennial energy review and was strongly supported by former Secretary Moniz. And now GAO is also saying we need to look at regional reserves, particularly in the Southeast and the West. And I, too, think that regional refined product reserves needs to be a part of any SPR modernization effort. Now, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you mentioned, I believe, that the Trump administration seems hostile to the concept. In fact, President Trump had proposed doing away with the Northeast Gasoline Supply Reserve, which had been created administratively by President Obama in response to the dangerous shortages that occurred in the wake of Superstorm Sandy, including in my area, New Jersey. And frankly, I think this administration's attempt to undo the Northeast Reserve is reckless, and that's why I introduced legislation to establish that reserve in statute. But it seems like everybody but the Trump administration sees the benefit establishing regional reserves, and particularly one in the Southeast, where states like Florida, Georgia, South, and North Carolina are extremely supply constrained, and those states are really vulnerable in the face of an extreme weather event. Yet this administration, and you, I think, said, don't want to take any action on that. So can I just ask you, Mr. Assistant Secretary, you said that the price of gasoline, I think, you correct me, I think you said that the price of gasoline goes back to normal soon after a storm like Sandy or Irma. What is that based on? I mean, that wasn't true in New Jersey after Sandy. Did I misunderstand you? I thought that's what you said. as one of the reasons why it wasn't necessary to have these regional reserves.
First, I wouldn't characterize the administration's position as hostile against the gas reserves. What I talked about before, what I talked about in my testimony, is A, the cost of these gasoline reserves, and I used...
Yeah, you said they would cost the government too much. And I mean, my understanding is, we only have 2.5 minutes. My understanding, you said that you were not supportive of it, or the administration wasn't, because the price of gasoline goes back quickly after a storm, like Sandy. I think you said Irma. And then you also said that the regional reserves would cost the government too much. So that I'm just asking you what those two things are based upon, because I'm wondering, wouldn't the same argument be used against the existing SPR? Why are you saying, I don't believe it's true that the price goes up quickly right after, and I don't believe that this is going to cost the government too much, certainly less than it costs to maintain the SPR. I'm just challenging those two statements, that's all.
Well, I can address the pricing issue with respect to Hurricane Irma. The prices came back down to relatively normal levels. I can't speak to every gasoline station around Florida, but as the product moved back into the state and retail stations were opening back up again, there was competition and prices reflected that. I think that the bigger issue is that if we set up reserves and we have these fairly sizable storage areas and we can't get the gasoline to the retail outlets because of congested roads due to evacuation and then flooded roads, then it is an expense that's not really serving the public good.
But what I was arguing, see, look, I understand what you're saying in all these cases, but I just would like to know, what that's based on. In other words, my experience in Sandy, which admittedly is only one hurricane, is that the price, it does take a while before the price goes back to normal, and that I don't know why it would cost more to have these regional reserves, significantly more than it does to maintain this SPR. I mean, I guess you could argue maybe that I'm not saying we shouldn't have an SPR, but I think the cost of the regional ones would actually be less. And it seems like everybody's suggesting that this is a good idea. There's going to be some cost to the government. But I just like to know, if you get back to me, tell me, what's the evidence that the price goes back quickly? Why are you saying it's going to cost so much? And now you're saying that they can't bring it to the gas stations. That's not my experience. So I just want you to get back to us and either now or get back to us and explain what these, what this is based on, because it seems to be contrary to everything I've heard.
Okay, we'll be happy to get back to you with some specific cost numbers and utilization.
All right, I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Olson.
I thank the chair and welcome Mr. Winberg. And please give your boss, Secretary Rick Perry, my best. It's not very good, but it's my best.
I will do so.
He'll know where that comes from. The SPR is important back home in Texas 22 in southeast Texas. You mentioned the status of your modernization program. Could you please talk about the most important steps DOE can take in this next year to continue to improve the readiness of the SPR?
Yes, sir, I can. Thank you. One of the steps that I mentioned already is the post-sale configuration study. And then the second one is we're developing the life extension program. We're in the process of pulling that together. And the life extension program is going to allow us to continue to meet our needs under IEA, number one. And then number two, the life extension program will focus on those assets that we're going to continue to need post-2027. That's the primary role of the life extension program.
Second question, sir. As you know, Texas oil production is booming. The Permian Basin itself is projected in a few years to produce more oil than every country in the world except for Saudi Arabia. One oil play in Texas takes over all the world except for one country, Saudi Arabia. A lot of that crude has to go to export, go to the Gulf Coast ports, goes to either Corpus Christi, Houston, Port Arthur, Beaumont, all those ports, Brownsville, goes there for refining and export. If we pass this discussion draft before us, do you think the oil industry will view the SPR sites on the Texas Gulf Coast as a good holding site for their oil? And are their needs looking more shorter term than what the SPR is designed for?
Answer to your first question, we're not yet sure how the commercial market is going to view this SPRO, this government asset, the SPRO, and our ability to potentially store oil for the commercial sector. That's part of the RFI, the request for information that we're going to send out so that we can better understand what the commercial industry needs and wants and whether the SPRO will fulfill that, that requirement. So as we get that information, I'll be happy to meet with the committee or meet with you individually and give you the results of the study.
Thank you. My final question, as we had these SPR drawdowns over and over and over, June of 2011, 30 million barrels of oil. August of 2012, 1 million barrels of oil. November of 2015, 58 million barrels. December 2015, 66 million barrels. January 17, 8 million barrels. Over and over. I'm curious to hear how about the state of the SPR is with all these drawdowns. Specifically, how much, we have a lot of light crude here at home. Are you happy about the balance between light crude and heavy crude in the SPR and the balance between sweet and sour oil? I know there's lots of people concerned, especially about heavier crude with a supply disruption because of this wave of sweet crude, light crude. Any concerns about the SPR's makeup with those issues, sir?
Well, I don't have any particular concerns about them, but that is part of the post-sale configuration study to evaluate sweet crude versus sour crude and what percentage we should have of both of those, given the changing dynamics in the oil production here in the United States. But I don't have any particular concerns about them right now.
My time's about to expire. I yield back. Thank you.
Mr. McNerney.
Well, I thank the chairman for holding the hearing, and I thank Mr. Barton for your work on it. I thank the witness for your thoughtful answers so far. Similar to the Northeastern Gasoline Supply Reserve, what do you think about establishing a reserve in the West for hurricane preparedness and other sorts of emergencies that we have out there as opposed to hurricanes, which we won't have? Earthquakes.
I think the same issues that we have are concerns about our ability to develop a surface reserve and then get that product in that surface reserve to the market where it's needed.
Well, I mean, you don't have a lot of warning for earthquakes, so you don't have an evacuation problem.
Well,
you have some roads disrupted, but I mean, I think it's a better case to be made in the West where we have those different sorts of emergencies.
That's true, but if we have an immediate earthquake situation, there's some road damage,
right.
That means that the gasoline can still move in through the normal infrastructure transportation mechanisms that it would. There may be some that would be cut off depending on where the earthquake happened and the effect of it and how many roads or rails might be damaged. But generally, there are multiple routes into into an urban area or a suburban area where there's.
So we have a
Operating
pretty good
allowance.
case to be made for establishing those reserves, the product reserves in the West.
I'm sorry, say that again.
We have a pretty good case to be made then for establishing those reserves in the West.
Well, I think if you have limited damage to road or railroad infrastructure, then you'd have to look at the cost of establishing that reserve and maintaining it, and whether it would provide a lot of value in the case of, in this example, an earthquake situation.
Okay, changing the subject a little bit. What about the challenges with respect to the infrastructure of the existing SPRO facilities? I mean, my understanding is that the extraction network infrastructure was aging and not in very good shape. We have the degradation of the caverns when you recycle, when you put in that water to push out the oil and so on. Can you talk a little bit more about that existing infrastructure?
Sure, and I think there's two parts of the infrastructure. One is the subsurface, and then the other is the surface. And we, on our life extension program that we're involved in right now, mostly that is surface infrastructure. So we're talking about pipes, pumps, and
Right.
Motors and that type of infrastructure. And so we've got a program in place to upgrade that because, as was mentioned earlier, the SPRO is celebrated its 40-year anniversary last year. The subsurface infrastructure, while we have had a number of withdrawals, the caverns are generally good for about 5 withdrawals and then refills before you start to see a lot of degradation. And so part of the assessment that we're looking at in the configuration study is the stability of the caverns, how much erosion, where it's not erosion, it's really.
Well, I mean,
all
5
fault.
cycles doesn't sound like a lot if we're going to be leasing out space.
Well, those are the cycles given, that's how what the caverns were designed for. If we leased it out under commercial operation, we might see considerably more than that because people store oil and they use it as a hedge. Price goes up, they're going to want to withdraw, and then they're going to want to re-inject. So it could happen many, many times, not, which is our concern about the integrity of the caverns.
What happens to the water when you inject water to pressurize release? What happens to that excess water? Does it just get absorbed into the landscape?
Yeah, the water stays down into in the cavern, and if we refill it, then we would extract the water.
So it's
But then we have to treat the water.
Is it better to be at 100% capacity, or is it better to be 90% capacity or some lower value?
Operationally, it's probably always better to be somewhere in that 90 to 100%, but there's a cost associated with being at that capacity level. You're storing oil in a lot of facilities.
All right, I thank the chairman. I'll yield back.
Chairman yields back, and before we move to Mr. Shimkus, Mr. Barton will have a brief announcement here.
I have a point of personal privilege. In the back of the room, my grandchildren, 2 of my granddaughters and my 2 daughters and their significant others are watching the hearing, and in typical millennial fashion, they're sitting on the minority side of the room. If they would stand up and let us acknowledge their presence.
Yeah. Maybe we'll let Mrs. Rush give them a call as well. Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McNerney's just leaving, but I wanted to follow up on some of his comments because he did raise maintenance as an issue, and this was going to be my third question, but I'm going to bring it up just in the timely manner that he addressed it. The GAO reported that the SPRO had experienced at least 5 major equipment failures since 2013, including a major pipeline failure that shut down the Big Hill site for 5 years. Could leasing underlying SPRO capacity help offset the cost of operations and maintenance?
Yes, and under 2 different scenarios. One, we might make the upgrades and then roll that into the price of the lease, but that would require appropriations. Another option, of course, is to have the entity leasing the space to make those upgrades.
Yeah, based on my experience with the appropriation committees, I wouldn't encourage the first course of action. I would think that maybe in the leasing agreement of upgrades, that would be a more straightforward process, but that's me. It was also talked about a little bit earlier in question and answers about spare caverns, and I think you being able to, in essence, lease those out, and there was some interest to that. Did I understand that question and answer process? Another member mentioned about excess space in other caverns and the ability to, lease that out to private entities.
Yes. Congressman, we have not yet tested the market, if you will, on commercial interest in leasing the space. That would be the subject of the request for information that we'll be sending out. Let
me also talk about, there's been some debate about the refined product reserves that are established, and I think there is a cost to doing this, right? A financial cost of setting these things up. Do you know what it is for the East Coast refined product?
Yes, it's we spend between $10 and $30 million a year for roughly 1 million barrels of gasoline.
That's per year.
Yes, sir.
So that I think it's credible for us to have the debate of a cost-benefit analysis. If we're spending that much $25 million a year for 1 million of refined product versus the timeliness of transportation and the access. I think that's where the debate is. Everybody would like to have a refined reserve available next door for disruption. In the Midwest, we have tornadoes and things go down and power goes off. But the question is 25 million for 1 million? I don't think that makes financial sense. So let me go to, I wanted to raise that. The last thing I want to address is U.S. will become a net energy exporter by 2022. That's the expectation. Do you agree with that?
Yes, sir, I do.
Do you think there's a need for a strategic petroleum reserve? I mean, I was a big supporter of this years ago when we were worried about our enemies around the world shutting off the sea lanes because we're importing our crude oil. But if we're a net exporter, does that even lend to the question of whether we need a SPRO?
I think it's difficult to forecast what kind of geopolitical challenges we might have.
Well, if we listen to Olson, Texas is going to supply the whole world. So
but there's also the hurricanes and other.
Well, and I would think that more speaks to pipelines and diversification of refinery bases, and I think that's occurring as we speak right now too, with the, North Dakota and some other places where we're having that occurring. So those are just questions I pose. It's great to have you here. We live in some exciting times. Whoever thought that we'd be exporting crude oil and exporting liquefied natural gas, and we all know the benefits for that, just for our balance and our income or the trade balance, but also for our allies who, in some places around the world, are being held hostage by foreign powers who really don't like us that much. So I appreciate it. Send my regards to the department. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here. You have a couple Texans on the committee, both Republican and one Democrat, but I have a district in East Harris County, and so the salt domes are created or there in Chambers County all the way through southeast Texas. This Congress and previous Congress have chosen to sell oil from the SPRO since 2015. The cumulative sale of these barrels, 250 million barrels, could occur by 2027. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And leave us an expected inventory of 410 million barrels.
405.
Yeah, 5, okay. I know we talked about it one time over the years. The SPRO had as much as 725 million barrels. Is that correct?
Yes, well, I think the capacity is 712 million
Okay.
barrels.
Although the authorization or the intent was to have 1 billion barrels
Yes, I believe.
back when it was created. You know, with what's happening today in the energy market, I can't imagine us, are we buying crude oil into the SPRO now?
No, we are not.
Okay. And because as a Texan, you want to buy it at 30 and sell it for 70. And so I would hope we would not be buying $70 a barrel of oil. One of the concerns I have is that during the Hurricane Harvey that was last year, Hurricane Ike that was 2008, even Katrina, because part of the SPRO goes into southwest Louisiana, has the storage facilities been damaged because of these hurricanes?
I think there was some surface damage, but that damage has been repaired, and the SPRO is fully capable of meeting its withdrawal requirements.
Okay. When this crude oil is selling from SPRO on the open market, do you have any idea who's buying it? Is it, you know, because I have 5 refineries in East Harris County that typically uses the heavier crude still, although they're retooling now because of the lighter sweet coming. Is it typically local refineries that are buying that, or are they other countries or anything else that you know of? And when you sell oil from the SPRO?
We do know who's buying the crude, and I don't have the specifics here with me, but I'm happy to get that information to your office with respect to whether it was domestic or international purchases.
You know, at one time, I think people would be concerned about someone from another country that's not an ally buying our crude oil. But since we're exporting crude oil now from everywhere I can imagine on the Gulf Coast in Texas and Louisiana, that's probably not a big issue. Is it the EOE SPRO post-sale configuration study, has it been completed?
No, sir. It's underway right now, and we expect that we will complete it this autumn.
Okay. The SPRO is at a lot of different sites in the Salt Dome, because some of that Salt Dome underneath Southeast Texas, Louisiana may not be qualified, or, you know, for how would we expand to get, if we wanted to get to 1 billion barrels, how could we do that? Is it engineeringly possible?
Yes, we could develop more storage capacity. If we ended up selling into the commercial market and we needed to develop the brine drive system so that we could flood the caverns and then re-inject oil, we would need some additional caverns for the brine storage system.
Okay. We're currently required to maintain a 90-day supply of crude oil, and currently we have a supply of about 170 days. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. I think that's correct.
In DOE's opinion, for the current level of reserves adequate for future potential disruptions?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And again, the market's changed so much because literally just down the road, we're seeing a lot of crude oil produced, although again, it's typically lighter sweet than compared to the heavier crude. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate you having this hearing on the oversight. This is kind of in the neighborhood for those of us in Southeast Texas, so we have a big interest in it. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Mr. McKinley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the sponsors of this legislation to consider that. Mr. Winberg, you've some of your testimony just raised more questions for me as a result. The one was your testimony. You talked about the annual cost for this, the gasoline reserve we have in the Northeast, about $25 to $30 million a year. But I remember a few years ago we were having that discussion about this, because it was done not by legislation but through the administration. That one of the discussions, we have to replenish that. You can't gasoline does not have a shelf life very long. So, is it physically emptied and restored? How's the mixture so that we know the age of that gasoline there?
Yeah, we do roll the gasoline, Congressman. I don't know specifically how many turns we do, but I can find that out.
Yeah, I'm just curious because if crude is selling for some $70 a barrel, but you're selling refined product at only $30 a barrel. Something's wrong with the math here. You must not be emptying it entirely and using it. So we can have more of a conversation. I'm just curious to see how that's functioning there. Also, that you talked about that five perhaps you can cycle about 5 uses or draw down about 5 times out of the salt dome. But if we go to this process, this is what I'm having a little concern with, by leasing it out to other entities, and then you indicated that perhaps they might want to draw down more often than 5. Do you see a possibility that you will have them posting bonds or some kind of verification so they pay for the repairs to the salt dome, that if that, or other security, so that someone with an outside interest could cause us to lose the integrity of our salt storage?
We believe we have a technical solution for the problem, and that technical solution would be what we're calling the brine drive system. So rather than injecting fresh water into the salt cavern to lift the oil, we would inject a saturated brine solution.
I heard you. I'd like to know a little bit more about that. You know, I heard you talk about some additional brine that you would put back into that. That was interesting. 2, how do you verify? Because we got the problem with the ethane storage hub up in the Appalachian area. How do you verify the thickness of the walls of the salt dome in an existing well as an operation? How are you doing that so that you could make an allocate determination, maybe 5 years it could reach its life? How do you verify that?
That's
the extent of degradation.
That's a great question, and Congressman, I don't know the answer, but I will get back to you and let you know specifically what testing mechanisms we use.
Just one engineer to another engineer. I'm just curious how you're going to do that. And the last is more about security. I've never really actually seen a map that showed where our salt domes are located until today. I didn't want to know where they were. Mm-hmm. But if I know now, hostile actors can know where those salt domes are, and if they're that important to our national security, why would we ever put it on a map where those things are?
Well, these are pretty large facilities, and so people know where they are. They're very secure.
My point again, Winberg, how secure are they? If someone, we lost at the Greenbrier. We used to have a bunker there for congressmen to go hide until someone revealed where it was, and then we had to do away with that. Now we're revealing where all these our strategic reserve is of 600 million barrels of gas or of crude oil. The bad actors know exactly where that is. So if we had to abandon the Greenbrier, what are we doing here?
Well,
how secure is it?
Yeah, we have an ongoing security program, and so we're updating it, both physical security as well as cyber security. We're opening up a new office in DOE, the Caesar, which is going to address the cyber issues. The physical security
it's not just cyber. I'm talking about something, a bad actor. I don't know that we have a iron dome outside these things, so I'm just curious how we're going to protect them.
Well, they're fenced in. We have guards, guns, and gates.
Ooh. I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman is back. The chair notes for the record that the Greenbrier is doing just fine because this week the Houston Texans started their practice for the football season at the Greenbrier. The chair note calls upon Dr. Bouchon for 5 minutes.
Over here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Weinberg. We spend more than $200 million per year on SPRO management and operations, yet most of the equipment is beyond its serviceable life. And there is a growing backlog of deferred maintenance. For example, GAO reported that the SPRO has experienced at least 5 major equipment failures since 2013, including a major pipeline failure that shut down the Big Hill site for 5 weeks. You're talking about changing to a brine-related way to extract oil. I mean, it seems like we need to catch up on this maintenance first. What's been the reason why there's a backlog of deferred maintenance and all the equipment's beyond its serviceable life, and what can we do about it?
Well, I think the backlog is because we didn't have appropriations sufficient to keep the facility in optimal operating condition. We
Okay,
now have.
I'm just going to interrupt you there for a second, because I think that's the answer we get from every federal agency, and no matter anytime we ask this question. But the appropriations, what specifically were there requested appropriations that didn't get appropriated? Were there no appropriations? I mean, there's more to it than that, I would imagine.
Would the gentleman yield?
I will yield.
I don't want to speak for the Department of Energy, but the draft legislation allows, without going through the appropriation process, funds generated by using this facility for private purposes to be used for maintenance of the facility. So we've tried to solve that problem in the legislation before us.
Thank you, Mr. Barton, because that's going to be my one of my next questions. So it sounds like we have probably had an appropriations issue over the years. I get that. And it seems like we need to address that. So the question, and as a follow-up to what Mr. Barton just said, could leasing underutilized space capacity help offset the cost of operations and maintenance?
Yes, I think it could. Again, we need to test them. We need to query the market and find out what value they place on this storage and what they're willing to pay for it.
Yeah, so potentially this draft legislation could help us solve what appears to be probably a long-standing issue with our maintenance and serviceable life of our equipment being at the end of its serviceable life if we find more money and put that into operation and maintenance. Also, most of the time it sits idle. Could some of the spare caverns, I think you went over this, and the answer is yes, be commercialized in such a way to improve its overall operational readiness?
Absolutely. Yes, sir.
And you described some of that. I was interested in the fact that on a commercial basis you'd have to have more going in and out all the time, right? Mm-hmm. Yes. Couldn't you isolate that to the commercial space versus the non-commercial space? So you're not talking about the entire reserve being accessed all the time. Were you talking about a way to cordon off, so to speak, what we could utilize, and in that way the caverns of the whole reserve wouldn't be at risk? That's
correct. We would utilize the brine drive system in those caverns where we were discharging and refilling on a frequent basis for commercial purposes. Also, I spoke earlier about leasing some of the space to other countries that are members of the IEA activity. And in that case, then those countries would not be withdrawing and injecting on a routine basis. And by having that capacity, our overall cost likely would go down because we would have more oil stored. So you'd spread the cost out over.
Right, so we would do that on a build-out basis, or they would pay for it, or we'd build out what they need, or they'd pay for that.
I think we would utilize the excess capacity we have, and if there was a big enough market, I think we could look at building out additional. But we're going to have 300 million barrels of capacity when we finish the drawdown in 2027.
Understood. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Duncan, 5 minutes for questions, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's no doubt that demand for oil is much greater now than when the SPR was originally developed. And I wonder, is the SPR big enough to have an impact in the case of a real crisis in the 21st century? Is it big enough?
I think it probably is big enough.
Is it storing enough?
I think it is storing enough right now. As we move into 2027, we're going to be very close to meeting our IEA requirements. In fact, we may.
Y'all looked at the demand as it applies in the 21st century here in 2018, right? Or,
yes, okay. we have, but a balancing factor for that, of course, is that we have much more domestic production. And that domestic production, while it takes several months to come online, it's much quicker than it was before the unconventional oil plays became commercial in the United States. So we're down to 4, 5, or 6 months to get wells online as opposed to several years.
So let me ask you this. In your opinion, has SPR been used effectively over the past 4 decades to respond to oil price volatility?
I believe it has, yes.
Been used effectively, okay. Has it been appropriately used as a tool to balance supply and demand?
I don't think that's not its purpose,
I mean,
to balance.
I remember the oil shortage in the 1970s, and since then we really haven't had a true oil shortage. We've had price volatility, right? So given the change in landscape, the fact that the United States is now a net exporter, do you see the SPR being able to balance the supply and demand, or even necessary to balance the supply and demand when we have an abundant supply now?
Well, the purpose of the SPRO was never to balance supply and demand, but rather its purpose was to be there in the event that there was a more of a crisis situation, rather than short-term supply and demand imbalances. And so that was its purpose. That still is its purpose. And I think where we are right now, even with the drawdowns, given the fact that we have much more domestic production and that production can come on much quicker, I think that we have sufficient reserves and sufficient capacity with the SPRO. However, getting to an earlier question, we do need to upgrade it and maintain mostly the surface facilities, but also subsurface facilities to make sure that we can meet the
Let me ask your opinion about Congress has sold off some of the SPR in order to cover deficits, and when we've had some of these crises since I've been in Congress, 8 years. Mm-hmm. It also seems like we always sell it for a lot less than we paid for it, and that's kind of opposite of buy low, sell high, right? That's the first thing. Who manages what price point we purchase or replenish? If you've got a high value asset that you paid less for, do y'all play the market in that regard and sell it at a higher price and buy it again at a lower price to help the American taxpayer?
When we have a release, we do it under an auction mechanism, so we get the highest price that the market's willing to pay. Under some releases, where we have a test sale, for example, then whoever buys that oil has to replenish that oil plus an additional amount of oil. So in that manner, we're paying for the cost of extracting the oil from the facility. But the SPRO and the operation of the SPRO does not play the market per se. We do it through an auction mechanism.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, 30 seconds I've got left. Since I've been in Congress, we've used the SPR as an opportunity to offset spending with cut-go or whatever. And that's wrong. This is a strategic petroleum reserve to help us in the time of a crisis, an oil shortage or restriction of flow of oil by OPEC like we saw in the late 1970s. And I'm always going to argue that this Congress, this government should not use this as a pay-for. It should be used as it's designed, but we also ought to manage it. And if you've got a bulk asset that you've got a high basis on, sell it, buy it low, and help the American taxpayer with that. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Tonko, are you ready, sir? Are you ready? 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Winberg, can you provide us with an update of DOE's current SPRO modernization plan? And how great is the need to invest in the infrastructure in order to keep it operating effectively?
Yes, to answer the second part of your question, I think the need is pretty great. This facility, as we've talked about, is over 40 years old. The last major upgrade was about 25 years ago. So we have piping, pumps, and valves that need to be replaced on the surface. So the need is pretty great. We've got a life extension program, and we're developing that program so that, A, we can best handle the legislatively mandated sales, and then B, the life extension program is being designed so that we can upgrade our systems to allow the SPRO to operate post-2027 for an additional 25 years. Having said that, the life extension program, the way it's been designed, it has enough flexibility so that if we decide we're going to lease space to other countries or commercial leases, we've got enough flexibility in the program so that we can adjust it, so that we're not using taxpayer dollars to upgrade systems that perhaps someone leasing would pay for.
Thank you. And do you believe there is a private sector demand for SPRO capacity?
That's a great question, and we don't know the answer to that yet. What we're planning to do is send out a request for information, an RFI, out into the marketplace. And what we want to find out is, A, is there a need for government-owned storage in the commercial market? B, how would they utilize that storage space if we leased it to them? And then C, are there concerns or issues with the government leasing space in a market that has mostly been done by commercial entities?
Right. So then, and how would it compare to existing storage options? For example, like tank storage or?
Right. We don't yet know the answer to that question either. That will be informed by the RFI. Once we know how private industry might want to utilize this storage, then we can put a cost, because there will be some capital needed in order to facilitate commercial storage activities.
And do you believe there's an opportunity to use the revenues raised by commercial leases to invest in modernization to benefit the public's use of SPRO?
I think there might be, but again, we're a little bit early in the process to know that right now. But that's certainly the hope. And I think if there wasn't value to the taxpayer, I'd question whether or not we want to enter into this type of an arrangement.
Okay. And SPRO is able to draw down and deliver crude oil within 13 days?
Yes, sir.
Are you confident that space can be leased without slowing down the federal government's ability to utilize SPRO?
That would be one of the key issues or key elements of any leasing program that we entered into with commercial clients, but also with other countries if we chose to go that route. The American taxpayers bought and paid for this thing. They've maintained it for the last 40 years. So our responsibility is to the U.S. taxpayers to make sure that, A, we're meeting our domestic oil requirements, and B, that we're meeting our international requirements as well.
I appreciate that. In the Northeast, we are particularly vulnerable to supply disruptions, which can be caused by natural disasters such as a hurricane like Superstorm Sandy. Mm-hmm. The Northeast Gasoline Supply Reserve was created to mitigate those risks. Excuse me, and thankfully it hasn't been needed yet, but that doesn't mean it won't be needed in the future. So I would really caution the administration against trying to dissolve this reserve. I think, again, for our region of the country, it's of great concern. And with that, I thank the chair and yield back.
Thank you. And seeing no more further witnesses, members seeking to ask questions, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Winberg, for coming today. All members should know they have 5 days to submit questions for the 10 days. Another panel. Okay, I'll back off. Thank you, Mr. Winberg. Before you leave, as Vice Chairman Barton will confirm, with your boss, you have to learn to say "gig 'em" over and over. Thumbs up. Gig 'em Aggies.
Thank you.
Uh-oh. You sure, Mike? Yeah. You sure? One more time. Thank you, Mr. Winberg.
Thank you.
Second panel, please come up. I just want him to know it. That's cool, yeah, that's cool, yeah. I had that, I saw that there. There we go, yeah, perfect, yep. It looks like we're ready, so let's kick off the second panel. Our witnesses for the second panel today include Mr. Frank Rusco, Director of Natural Resources and Environment at the GAO, Mr. Daniel Evans, Project Manager for Fluor Federal Petroleum Operations, and Mr. Kevin Book, Managing Director for Clearview Energy. We are so thankful for y'all being here today. We'll begin this panel with Mr. Frank Rusco. You are recognized for 5 minutes to give an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of the subcommittee. I'm pleased to be here today to discuss our recent report on DOE's management of the SPR. The SPR is an important energy security asset capable of mitigating negative effects of global oil supply disruptions in concert with other IEA member countries. In several collective actions of IEA members, the SPR has been effective at adding oil supply during actual or expected supply disruptions. To date, however, the SPR has most often been used in response to domestic supply disruptions caused by extreme weather. In such events, the SPR has been less effective because SPR infrastructure has not been able to deliver reserves when, where, and in the form they are needed. In particular, when severe weather has battered Gulf Coast states, damaging refineries or electricity grids needed to run pipelines, SPR oil reserves in the Gulf Coast have not been effective in mitigating what have generally been shortages in finished petroleum products, such as gasoline and diesel fuel. Most IEA member countries hold significant parts of their strategic reserves as petroleum products. DOE has studied such product reserves, and the conclusions of its studies point to net benefits in some regions. Yet DOE has disagreed with our recommendation to complete these studies and advise Congress of its findings. In addition, we found that DOE's most recent strategic analysis of the SPR, which was mandated by Congress, was deficient in several key ways. These deficiencies deny Congress better information to make decisions about the size, disposition, and configuration of the SPR. For example, DOE did not do adequate risk-based scenario analyses of when the SPR may be called upon to deliver oil or petroleum products, and as a result, DOE cannot advise Congress on even a credible range of sizes, composition, or disposition of reserves that would best enhance energy security across a range of potential future events. Further, in part because of the way in which the SPR has been used over the years, and in part just because needed maintenance has been deferred for many years, the SPR storage and delivery infrastructure is in serious disrepair. DOE's current plan is to rebuild the existing SPR infrastructure in its historical configuration and capacity. If this is done, and given planned future sales of SPR oil, the SPR will have excess storage capacity in the future. However, DOE made its plan to rebuild and repair SPR infrastructure without adequately studying alternatives including selling or leasing such excess capacity. The discussion draft that is the focus of this hearing goes a long way toward requiring DOE to rectify some of the deficiencies in its strategic study and its SPR modernization plan. Specifically, Specifically, the discussion draft requires DOE to take actions to evaluate and test the market for leasing its excess capacity by 1, authorizing the leasing of storage and related facilities to private sector and foreign entities, 2, directing revenue earned from such leases to the general fund and to cover costs associated with leasing, and 3, requiring a pilot program to lease 200 million barrels of excess capacity. To make fiscally prudent decisions about how to implement such a pilot, DOE will have to conduct additional analyses. For example, DOE's decision to use fresh water to displace oil during releases has caused the SPR's salt caverns to deteriorate over time with use. Fresh water absorbs salt, which increases the size and alters the shape of caverns and damages their integrity. Alternatively, there are salt cavern facilities operated by the private sector that use brine to displace the oil during the release, which does not have these effects. Brine ponds add operation and maintenance costs, but increase the life of caverns. Ideally, GAO should evaluate this and many other factors we have identified before finalizing its modernization plans to ensure the SPR is run in an effective and fiscally prudent manner. Thank you. This ends my oral remarks. I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Mr. Rusko. Mr. Evans, 5 minutes for an opening statement, sir.
Good morning, Vice Chairman Olson, Ranking Member Rush.
Microphone, please. Sounds like hit the red button there.
On here. There we go. Start again. Good morning, Vice Chairman Olson, Ranking Member Rush, and members of the Subcommittee on Energy. I'm the project manager for Fluor Federal Petroleum Operations, Dan Evans. We are the maintenance and operation contractor for the Department of Energy at the Strategic Petroleum Reserve since 2004. Fluor's partnerships with DOE date back to the Manhattan Project. Today, in addition to the SPR, we are currently active in roles with DOE facilities that are part of the Environmental Management and National Nuclear Security Administration missions. The congressionally mandated sales have changed the day-to-day operations of the SPR dramatically. The sites have gone from a 4.4 million barrel per day drawdown readiness posture to maintaining drawdown readiness while at the same time conducting intermediate variable rate deliveries from the reserves. Working with DOE, Fluor has met this challenge. One example is the response to the impacts to Hurricane Harvey. We were able to maintain mission drawdown readiness throughout the event and deliver approximately 5 million barrels of crude oil to refineries in need. I would like to note that to support this need, certain employees volunteered to leave their own homes at peril, their whole families, and endure the hurricane at the SPR Texas sites. They provided day-to-day monitored conditions and real-time updates on the readiness for us to fill the nation's mission. The dedication of SPR employees to the mission is American exceptionalism at its finest. The sales have and continue to put a significant level of stress on aging SPR infrastructure. In some cases, we have postponed planned maintenance and diverted funding to address emergency repairs. As we continue the drawdown over the next 9 years, Congress should not lose sight of the importance of the SPR's annual maintenance funding to be able to address the needs of the sites and make necessary repairs to execute the current contemplated drawdown schedule. Next, I'd like to address the ideas raised by the subcommittee's discussion draft. Fluor, of course, stands ready to support the leasing and operation of underutilized cavern capacity. We anticipate in the particular draft legislation the committee has provided the authorization without further appropriation to use a portion of leased revenue costs related to storage and removal incurred by the SPR as a result of the leases. Commercially leased petroleum storage presently operates under one of two models, segregated or commingled. In segregated storage, the product accepted for storage is the same product that is ultimately delivered. Under the commingled model, a limited range of products are accepted for storage. When a withdrawal is made, a product of agreed-to specification is then provided to the owner of the equivalent product that was accepted into storage. Either model presents challenges for leasing and SPR facilities while maintaining government inventories. Presently, the government practices intensive inventory management, segregating crude oil by 2 specifications and tracking the volumes down to the very barrel, not only across caverns, but also within piping, pipelines, and crude oil storage tanks. If the SPR designates specific caverns to be leased up for storage under the segregated model, the cavern is nonetheless integrated into the site infrastructure. The operation of a storage cavern requires a routine ability to convey crude oil, water, and salt brine in and out of the cavern for purpose of preventative and corrective maintenance. The cycling of fluids in and out of leased caverns with equipment in common with the SPR storage caverns will inevitably lead to commingling of government and commercial assets, which will, in our opinion, require additional capital investments. The commingled model shares the same challenges of the segregated model and also adds additional complexities in terms of product quality matters and tracking thereof. In conclusion, 2 policy issues require resolution prior to implementing a lease storage concept. The first is the target inventory of the SPR. Congress should also carefully consider the overall leasing concept to be adopted. We strongly recommend that should Congress move forward with a leasing regime, it allows sufficient time to make this determination and to develop and physically implement the necessary SPR enhancements. Mr. Vice Chairman, thank you again for the opportunity to appear here today. I stand by to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. Mr. Book, 5 minutes for an opening statement, sir.
Thank you. Good morning, Vice Chairman Olson, Ranking Member Rush, Vice Chairman Barton, and distinguished members of this committee. My name is Kevin Book. I lead the research team at Clearview Energy Partners, an independent firm that analyzes macro energy issues for institutional investors and corporate strategists. Thank you for inviting me to contribute to your discussion regarding modernization of the SPR. I'd like to begin by offering my admiration for the foresight the U.S. Congress showed in creating the SPR. In my view, it remains one of the greatest energy security achievements in modern history. It still matters, too, even with U.S. crude production averaging 11 million barrels per day during the week ending July 13. That surge is good news, but those barrels already have customers. As a government-controlled stockpile, the SPR can provide emergency supply that comes from outside the market. That said, ensuring against worldwide economic fallout and sheltering U.S. consumers may require a robust and well-functioning reserve capable of delivering its full design capability. Today's discussion reflects that Congress has passed 6 major laws in the last 4 years that mandate roughly 300 million barrels of oil sales from the SPR. Those sales could leave the SPR with approximately 400 million barrels at the start of fiscal 28. It therefore seems prudent to ask whether and how the resulting surplus storage capacity might be put to productive use. Today's legislative draft would expand storage leasing currently available to foreign governments so that private commercial entities could lease SPR space too. In my opinion, a pilot leasing program of this sort could potentially benefit U.S. producers and refiners in need of additional storage. If that program also helped to preserve or expand SPR capabilities at the same time, it could enhance petroleum supply insurance for U.S. consumers too. My testimony offers several additional considerations. From a feasibility perspective, DOE might wish to evaluate the costs of restoring, rehabilitating, or improving spare capacity to support the requirements of commercial lessees. Those requirements can differ in many cases from current long-term strategic storage requirements. DOE might also wish to evaluate availability of takeaway capacity from leased storage sites, especially in the absence of incremental SPR marine distribution capacity. Storage with faster deliverability can command a higher market price also. From a competitiveness perspective, it may be useful for DOE to evaluate the market impact of introducing up to 200 million barrels of crude storage into the Gulf Coast, also known as PADD 3. In March 2018, the Energy Information Administration, or EIA, counted 341.2 million barrels of working storage capacity at refineries, tank farms, and underground facilities in PADD 3. The agency assessed that about 49% of that capacity was in use at that time. That was a big change from 2 years earlier. Storage volumes grew by 29.7 million barrels since the EIA's March 2016 report, and in that report, the agency assessed PADD 3 storage capacity at a much higher 68% capacity utilization. It could be undesirable if additional low-cost government-run SPR storage were to crowd out existing privately operated facilities. Likewise, salt cavern storage tends to be significantly cheaper than tank storage and so-called floating storage in leased tankers, but drawdown constraints and takeaway bottlenecks could limit commercial demand compared to tank farms and ships. Finally, from a strategic perspective, capacity leasing should probably also reflect the vision Congress and the Department have for the reserve. For example, today's draft would allocate net balances to the general fund. It might be worth considering whether proceeds could also pay for expanded modernization. To this point, the U.S. has dramatically reduced its net petroleum imports, but U.S. refiners still import gross volumes of about 6.3 million barrels per day. When they do, they pay global prices that reflect global supply-demand balances. Today's oil prices remain high relative to historical norms. Partly this is because global oil production is itself running at relatively high capacity utilization. Crude prices are also high because global inventories have thinned out. Currently, OPEC producers are drawing on spare capacity to offset losses from collapsing Venezuelan production. They soon could lean even harder on spare production capacity to replace Iranian crude oil barrels. That, by the way, set off my Siri. I apologize. I'm not sure why. And what happens when the production system is stressed and inventories are lean and a big supply disruption occurs somewhere in the world? In that situation, without strategic reserves, the oil market must balance, and painfully so, on the backs of consumers. Preventing that result, in short, is the nature of the insurance the SPR provides. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my prepared testimony. I will be happy to answer any questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Mr. Book, and thank you, all our witnesses. I will now move into the Q&A portion of the hearing. I'll begin the questioning, recognize myself for 5 minutes. First of all, again, welcome to our 3 experts. A special welcome to Mr. Evans. Fluor Enterprise, big, tall building, 1 street light up from my official office there in Sugar Land, Texas. So welcome, 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 dear friend. My first question is for you, Mr. Book. As I point out on the first panel, Texas oil production is booming. I won't brag, but right now we're moving a lot of light crude to the coast about as fast as we possibly can. If the SPR were open to lease by the industry, do you think, first of all, number 1, there'd be interest? Number 2, would there be value as a holding location for more oil? Or would the benefits be in the uncertainties going forward with leasing this great asset we have, the SPR?
Congressman, I think bragging is appropriate, and you should be proud. That crude is going to keep going to the coast, as you say, and exported to global markets that can use it for value. I think Secretary Winberg was wise to suggest that an inquiry of commercial interest would be a good place to start. One of the issues that you have right now is that you do have storage building at export and transit sites in the Gulf Coast, and it's building quite rapidly. The SPR could serve a different purpose for long-term storage today, but as the other witnesses have mentioned, it would require adaptation to be potentially useful for the kinds of commercial applications that different kinds of customers might use. But definitely there's going to need to be more storage if you in Texas keep producing more crude.
Count on it, guaranteed. Second question is for you, Mr. Rusco. As you know, the DOE has taken some steps in modernizing the SPR. However, much work still remains, and at the moment, the SPR seems to lack a clear end goal. Can you talk about the most important steps DOE has taken, what you think the best pathway forward for them to get this thing up and running and modernized?
I'm encouraged that the Assistant Secretary was talking about testing the market and going out and trying to figure out like what the market is, and also that is cognizant of the differences in the way that different entities might use excess capacity. So it's our cost of storing fuel, oil in the ground is much lower than most IEA members' costs, and there are members that would like to store oil in reserves. So that may be ultimately the best way, but you got to test the market to know. I'm encouraged about that. What I'm concerned about is DOE has not done a good job of periodically assessing how the market has changed, how energy security issues have changed, and doing complex risk-based analysis involving scenarios of possible use. That's what they need to do.
And thank you, Mr. Winberg is right over your left shoulder, so message accepted and sent. Thank you so much. Final question for you, Mr. Evans of Fluor. The SPR sites are made for long-term storage, but we certainly have a lot of maintenance issues. Fluor has been maintaining this asset for over almost 2 decades, as you said. Could you please tell me about the most common cause of maintenance issues and whether the DOE or the private sector can be better suited to fix these problems as quickly as possible?
So the most common maintenance issues that we face today are with regards to the equipment that was not placed during life extension 1. That was the 91 to 95 time frame. We have a lot of piping, valves, actuators, and those kinds of pieces of equipment that are 40 years old. We did have a rupture in a low-pressure freshwater system at Big Hill that was a dramatic one, and that's our second significant rupture there. We find more and more common leaks, and we're able to deal with them very quickly, but life extension 2, and if it's smartly coupled with a concept to commercialize, could replace and deal with those highest level of common kinds of maintenance risks. We also have a very old degasification plant that's on its last legs at the West Hackberry, Louisiana site. Part of LE2 then is to recycle that and come in with a new, much more modular, modern design that will be more efficient to make sure that we can deliver crude oil even during difficult hot months into the pipeline system.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. My time has expired. Now, call on the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Rush, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to ask each witness if you would give me feedback on this draft legislation. Do you feel that there's a need for the draft, or do you find it helpful, or are you concerned about any of the unintentional consequences? And I'd like to just ask each one of you if you would respond to the question. And beginning with you, Mr. Rusko.
I think that the draft legislation addresses an important issue that DOE had not been thinking about when they planned their modernization, and that is that there is going to be excess capacity. And it makes good sense to try to use that capacity in a way that can help pay for the modernization and pay for the routine operations and maintenance, so that we don't end up 10, 20 years later with a bunch of deferred maintenance and depreciated usefulness of the assets.
Mr. Rush, we are at Fluor is here to implement these at the pleasure of the Congress and at the Department. We certainly would be responsive in the near term to integrating immediate teams needs to, as mentioned earlier, to go to the market to understand what market demands are, to perform engineering and operations analysis studies that would take a look at what we needed to do to operate under market conditions. Number 3, see how to fully integrate those with Life Extension 2 so we can take advantage of this significant change in investment that Congress is making in the SPR, and then do all the environmental studies necessary as well to make sure that that operates as an integrated smart whole. I do think that with the addition of things like brine caverns that were mentioned earlier by Secretary Winberg, those would be very beneficial for overall operation in the long run for the SPR, for the government, as well as for commercial customers.
Mr. Mook.
Congressman Rush, I think it's a good idea to make the best use of what you have, particularly if you have a way of making money for the taxpayer using an asset owned by the taxpayer. That's always a good idea. You asked about unintended consequences, and I think that Secretary Winberg has already suggested that he wants to take a look at the implications of this. Part of understanding the role of government is understanding the way in which government actions can impact private investment. It's always a bad idea to lean too heavy with the government on something where private industries put capital to work. And so if I had any concern, it would be that there would be a risk potentially of commercially undercutting existing investments. But until one looks at it, there's no reason to not proceed with looking into it.
I want to thank each and every one of you. Director Rusko, in your testimony, you state that if DOE is authorized to lease unused storage capacity to the private sector, as this bill would do, this leasing capacity could generate revenue that could help offset the cost of modernization. Are you confident that DOE will indeed look at this issue? And if not, what are some of the missing opportunities of not examining this particular topic or subject?
I'm confident that DOE will pay attention to what you all do, and my concerns are sort of where the bill doesn't specify what to do, and DOE has not been very proactive in evaluating the strategic, purpose and future on an ongoing basis of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. And hence, we got to a point where we clearly, according to a lot of folks in Congress, had more oil than we ought to have. There's going to be a lot of drawdowns, but that was done without a really quality strategic look at the pros and cons of that from DOE.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
And thank you. The chair now calls upon the one man who knows more about this topic than any single human being in Congress, Vice Chairman of the Full Committee, Chairman Joe Barton. 5 minutes, sir.
Well, I'm not sure that's true, Mr. Chairman, but if it is true, that still doesn't say much. So, well, but it does point out a fact is that there really hasn't been a strategic look at the SPR in a long time. And the last 3 or 4 Congresses, as our oil production has ramped up in the United States, especially since the repeal of the crude oil export ban and our ability to lessen our imports, the Congress is using this as a piggy bank. And it's not being evaluated. We need money, let's take oil out of the SPR. This on committee, we did it in the last Congress, 21st Century Cures. We needed some money. We've got jurisdiction over the SPR, so we just said we're going to sell some oil and use it. The Budget Committee's using it. The omnibuses and the appropriation processes. Long story short, under current law, even though it says that only the president can make a decision to use the reserve, and he has to declare that it's a national emergency, Congress says, notwithstanding any other law, we're going to sell oil for this or that or bacon fat. And so this draft bill before us says we don't want to change the basic mission statement, but we want to add a mission statement. Under current law, you can't use the SPR for storage for private purposes. It's illegal. And so we decided, well, let's see if maybe the private sector wants to use it. Now, Mr. Book's concerns, we don't want the private sector to be crowded out in storage capacity. I think that's valid, but it's not mandatory. We're going to, if we don't sell another barrel of oil other than what we've already authorized, we're going to have over 100 million barrels of existing capacity that could be utilized, maybe 2 to 3. We were authorized up to 1 billion barrels, but we don't have the capacity, current physical capacity, but about a little over 700 million. Let's see if the private sector might want to use that. And this problem of being able to maintain the reserve, because it has to be appropriated. We've got to ask the appropriators to appropriate it, and some years they do, some years they don't. We changed that. We give a specific authority to the secretary. All the money goes into the general fund, but we allow money from rentals fees to be used to maintain and improve the reserve without and go through the appropriation process. That puts control in this committee, in the Energy and Commerce. So we're trying to fix that problem. I guess I'll ask Mr. Book, given the existing market dynamic, would the private sector decide to utilize the reserve to store their own crude oil? What's your bet on that?
Well, if you ask an analyst to take a bet, you're probably going to get an analyst answer. It could be right or wrong, and I'll come up with a new one for you when it's wrong. But the private sector breaks down into different sets of customers. So you do have folks who are trading oil. And when the future price of oil is higher than the current price of oil, there's an incentive to store. They're going to want to move oil out of their storage pretty quickly when the market turns around, as it sometimes does. And then you have the government customers that were mentioned and other potential long-term storage customers or longer-term storage customers who may have different needs. And I think until you ask and see what's on offer out there, it's hard to know. Right now, what you have are midstream companies that are building out storage as they're developing transit capabilities, leasing that storage, and coming up with innovative new ways.
But they're having to pay the capital cost to build and operate it.
Well, that's right. They do have.
And under this case, you'd have existing capacity that it's a lease or a rental. I'm not sure how we would do it, but there's no upfront cost. I mean, except a commitment, probably a time certain commitment.
Yeah, I mean, the costs of salt cavern storage are generally cheaper than tank storage and certainly cheaper than leasing a ship to store it in floating storage when things get tight. So it could be very competitive.
Well, what we're trying to do, Mr. Rush and I, we have an asset that's underutilized. We're going to have excess capacity. Why not have a new mission statement that complements the private sector, allows the private sector, but doesn't mandate the private sector? Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't, but we're not going to be any worse off than we are, and we will probably be better off if the private sector makes a decision to utilize it, because it's going to give some funding that's at the discretion of the Secretary of Energy to improve the facility, and I think it's worth a shot, but there may be other ideas. Anyway, my time's expired.
Thank you. The chair now calls upon the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, for 5 minutes, sir.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate Mr. Barton's remarks about this. But I have a question, is sort of philosophical question, is leasing capacity to foreign governments or private entities, is that going to degrade the capacity, the long-term capacity of the caverns? Mr. Evans.
I'm not an expert in the interest of foreign governments. I think that if appropriately handled, that the caverns themselves can remain integral. If we use brine drive to be able to handle those issues and don't do multiple small drawdowns, that we could continue to operate those in the interest of the government should we wish to terminate agreements with either commercial or foreign countries.
Well, Mr. Rusco, do you believe that the current proposed legislation will give us enough information to provide that guidance to the operating the SPRO effectively and not degrading its capability?
I think that the implementation of this legislation by DOE would matters a lot. They would have to implement this in a way where there are controls. So, for example, if they were to lease this to other IEA members lease the excess capacity to store long-term oil, which I want to say we have the cheapest storage of anybody in the world, and we know of at least 2 countries that have actually contacted DOE about leasing space like this. If you did that, then you're really enhancing global energy security, because you have larger storage of crude oil in exactly the same place that it would be if we owned it all. Now, if the private sector owns it, then we have smaller capacity here. Other countries have to have their storage capacity somewhere else. And
so my question is, does the proposed legislation give us and you, the operators, the capability to operate it in a way that would be beneficial rather than detrimental to the long-term capacity? Or does it need to be enhanced or improved?
I think that what I have read, which is just the discussion draft, that you could implement this in a way that would give you flexibility to say, okay, if we want more of that capacity for our own storage, then when a contract is terminated, you could take it back and use it as U.S. storage. So I believe it would have that flexibility.
Okay, thank you. Again, Mr. Rusco, do you think there's a good enough case for product reserve capacity in the western part of the country, in the West Coast, where we have earthquakes?
We looked at studies that were done by DOE, and those studies came to the conclusion that in the case of the Southeast and the West Coast, there were net positive benefits to these things. DOE chose not to release those reports. They say they're not complete. They've chosen not to complete those reports. But everything that is in those reports indicates that there are net positive benefits to that.
Thank you. Mr. Evans, you talked a little bit about commingling and the inevitability of commingling, and refineries are specialized in terms of the kind of oil they take. How is the commingling going to impact the refinery's ability to produce product, gasoline and other products?
I think it's a great question. Each particular demand would be somewhat different, Congressman, but however, if we were to lease to say a Shell or a commercial entity, the crude oil that would be stored there in their own cavern, if you would think that it would make sense for them to store the material that they would utilize most effectively in terms of a turnaround of a refinery without products. So I think the market handles that piece. We'd have to be very careful about commingling the crude oil with the government oil, and those are practices that are commonly done. This is not an impossibility, but we are, for example, very sensitive to high gas content oil in our reserves. We believe that's very detrimental to the overall safety and quality of the reserves. So we'd have to manage that extremely carefully. We think our current regime is a good one in terms of being able to respond to refinery needs on an instant basis, and if we were able to add similarly to that mix within the right blend level, that ought to be utilized well as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Doyle, 5 minutes for questions, sir.
And thank you to the witnesses today. Let me just ask all the witnesses. It's been noted, I think, in Mr. Rusco's testimony that the U.S. will become a net exporter in the late 2020s, but then become a net importer again in 2040, 2050s. So in your opinion, how should the U.S. be prepared for this long-term outlook for the SPRO?
Our most recent report is not the first time we've recommended to DOE that they do periodic strategic studies of conditions and report to Congress about what they see coming down the pike. So if we see a situation where our net imports are going to be increasing over the next few decades, at some point, DOE should be up here talking to you all and saying, we need to rethink our capacity. Similarly, if they think that that risks have either reduced or increased of global supply disruptions, or if there's big changes to demand or supply in any other way, all of that stuff needs to be modeled on a regular basis so that they can give you really quality information so you can make good decisions.
You agree with that, Mr. Evans?
I do. I think the market volatility is very significant right now. I'm not an expert in global markets, but reading the newspaper leads me to believe that there are a number of scenarios that could be invoked over time, and certainly a value in having a reserve.
Mr. Book?
Yeah, I think it would take, humility would be the minimum requirement for anyone looking at the global oil market, given how much things have changed over the last 10 years.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Rusko, you mentioned that $2 billion from the sale of crude oil from the SPRO is authorized for the modernization program. Has this been implemented, in your opinion, effectively so far, and do you have a status update on the use of these funds?
I don't have an up-to-date status. I know that there have been some sales. I think it's $700 million, but I don't think most of that money or much of that money has actually been spent. I think that DOE is doing some further analysis before they actually spend that money, but I can't give you much more of an answer. I could give you something for the record.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Evans, how safe is the current infrastructure, and how is your company prioritizing and planning for long-term safety?
So we are very safety conscious. You'll note our last 3 years on the SPR are the safest years that we've seen in the 40-year operation. It's one of Fluor's core values. We are very sensitive to the infrastructure and the quality of the infrastructure. We run routine programs and investigations that will allow us to take a look at the quality, for example, of the piping and those kinds of things. In the short term, it's manageable. With, for example, the degasification unit, it's on its last legs. We're not going to extend that unit. Simply is infeasible and impossible to do that. When we invest in Life Extension 2, we will specifically look at those old and perhaps more risky components that need to be removed, and to see how we can possibly configure those to be in a more safe and operating environment in the future. For example, old pipelines that are 40 years old, that are underground, that are not possible to send a smart pig through, perhaps we want to reroute those and have a different method to be able to track the quality of what we've done. So those are all a part of the department's plans in moving forward.
So tell me, what type of financial investment does Congress as well as the DOE need to make to update and secure the SPRO's infrastructure?
Well, I think the current roughly $1.4 billion is a terrific start in getting the infrastructure where it needs to go. It certainly attacks the high-profile things that we've got in our infrastructure. It, however, will not replace all of the issues. We'll need to have a continual authorization and appropriation for major maintenance projects as they come around, because by no means are we able to use the current funding to replace everything that we know that will be coming along in the next 5 to 10 years.
You have any idea what that number looks like down the road?
I'm sorry, I do not, sir. We can take a look at that and get back to you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Doyle. Mr. Tomko, 5 minutes for questions, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And welcome, gentlemen. Mr. Rusko, as we have heard this morning, there have been a number of legislative requirements to sell SPRO oil in recent years. Do you believe that the frequent changes to SPRO's long-term size target have impacted DOE's ability to develop and maintain a modernization plan?
Well, I think that DOE's modernization plan was made largely without consideration for those sales, and now they're adjusting to those sales and doing further analyses. So I think the modernization plan will also be affected by any legislation that comes out of this Congress about leasing excess capacity. But even if Congress does not mandate that they look into leasing excess capacity, DOE should do something with its excess capacity. They should either tell you that they need to shrink capacity or or sell some, for example, but they need to do something, because just leaving that excess capacity there is just throwing money away.
Thank you. And Mr. Evans, depending on how the leases are structured, might they result in additional stress on aging SPRO infrastructure, requiring greater investments in modernization and improvements that then might otherwise be required?
It is certainly hopeful that we'll, with decisions made on a timely basis to go forward from Congress, that we'll be able to integrate many of the needs for commercialization within the current LE2 environment, since there are significant upgrades to pipelines and those kinds of things. Certainly, we are not currently intending to build brine drive caverns, and that's an additional cost that we would incur. There may be other costs associated as well with piping interlinking and valving and control room modifications. Right now, we're not aware of those. However, I would venture that in the long term, those would also benefit the longevity and utilization of the reserve.
Thank you very much. And this question, I guess, could go to any of the three of you. It's my understanding that the proposed pilot program would allow DOE to recover additional costs from the leases. How much of the proposed pilot program's revenues should be dedicated to investing in the SPRO modernization?
I don't have a number figure. That's probably better answered to you when we have some more detailed engineering studies and get back to you on that topic.
Anyone else? Mr. Book, anything?
I'm just an analyst, sir.
Mr. Rusko, currently is DOE able to enter into an agreement with a foreign nation to store oil at the SPRO without a change to the statute?
We believe that's correct, yes.
Thank you. And Mr. Book, I noticed in your testimony that there are other nations that meet their IEA requirements by holding oil abroad. Are there any reasons why entering into a contract with a foreign government may be preferable?
Well, the long-term nature of government strategic reserves comports with the existing infrastructure capabilities of the SPRO today. So the customer of first resort would be the customer that requires the least incremental maintenance. For that reason, it might make sense.
Mm-hmm. And do you believe that there would be demand from the private sector to lease this space?
Well, it depends an awful lot on what a market test shows. There's going to be demand for more storage for crude oil in Pad 3 because there's going to be more crude oil production that will need to be stored.
Okay. Anyone else have ideas on that?
I'm sure there's going to be private interest in this capacity. It's the cheapest way to store oil. Now, you have to make changes in the way that you take it in, put it in, and take it out. You have to use the brine drive to do that, but it's still going to be cheaper.
Right. Mr. Evans, did you want to comment on that?
We would also agree that with Mr. Book that it would be simplest, most efficacious, and perhaps quickest to be able to lease whole caverns to foreign governments as a instantaneous benefit to them and to the U.S. government as well.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen, and thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. And the chair now calls upon the ranking member, Mr. Rush, for one additional question.
I really, Mr. Tonko opened up some thoughts, and I just wanted to ask you. We've been talking a lot this morning about private interests, and I don't think we've given enough thought and consideration to foreign governments. Are any of you aware of any interest by foreign governments in leasing the underutilized storage space here in the U.S. And can you what's the potential for?
Well, we spoke with representatives from Australia and New Zealand, both of whom have an interest in leasing oil and space in the SPRO, and they have actually spoken with DOE about this in the past.
Is there any just those two nations?
Yes, but
do you see any potential for other similarly situated foreign governments?
I would be surprised if there are not other governments that are interested because of the differential cost. A lot of countries are storing oil and product in tanks, and if you can store oil in a salt dome, it's much cheaper, and so I would assume that there would be additional interest.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You're back.
Thank you. And seeing no further members wishing to ask questions, I'd like to thank our witnesses for coming today. And before we leave, Mr. Evans, one special tie we have together. We have the floor tie, but I just found out my dad was a fighting Siwash. Knox College, played football there, 56 through 60.
Are you kidding me? That is absolutely amazing, Mr. Olson.
No Prairie Fire, Siwash.
When I was at Knox, which is a terrific institution, we were the fighting Siwash, and I've never, unfortunately, given that up. That's so amazing.
As Mr. Rush knows, that's in Galesburg, Illinois.
Galesburg.
Knox College.
Grew up in Illinois and went to school there, and my family's lived there since the 1850s. Knox is a terrific institution.
Yes,
Thank
sir.
you for that.
Yes, sir. And before we conclude, I ask unanimous consent to submit the following documents for the record: a report from the GAO and a report from the Center on Global Energy Policy. In pursuant to committee rules, I remind members that they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record, and ask that witnesses submit their responses within 10 business days upon receipt. Without objection, this subcommittee is adjourned. Go Siwash.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, thank you. My mom shook his ass. He's messing with you, calling up their phone. Good hearing. Yeah, good stuff. Practical problem solving. Yeah.